Thank you, Susan. We're now going to take the thoughts from Kirsty and Peter. If you've got questions, enter them into the comments bar on the right-hand side. They're being collated. And when Kirsty and Peter have finished giving us their thoughts, then we'll start working our way through some of those. Quite a few have already come in. Okay, so I'd just like very quickly to introduce Kirsty and Peter. So Kirsty-Louise Campbell is Head of Strategy and Innovation at Police Scotland, where she's developed the overarching strategic outcomes for policing and various strategies for public contact with the police. Peter Langmead-Jones is Head of External Relations and Performance at Greater Manchester Police, where he supports the development of leadership, performance management and accountability. And he's also a visiting fellow at the School of Business and Economics at Loughborough University. So I'm going to hand over to Kirsty first for her thoughts and John and Susan's paper, and then we'll hear from Peter, and then we'll open it up for questions from yourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really welcome the insights and learning from both the presentations today. As the Strategy, Insight and Innovation Lead in Police Scotland, I'd like to respond with an overview of some of the areas where policing is changing in what I think are some really important ways as we respond to considerable demands and challenges, some of those that you can see that I have put up on the slide there just now. I'm going to do this from a perspective of the role of strategy, insights and innovative approaches to service design, and I'll consider how policing does, in both meaningful and practical ways, work with the public and communities, very much in line with our values of fairness, integrity, respect and human rights. One of the first pieces of work that we did in Police Scotland was to look very much at how we were assessing crime and assessing our response to crime. And that involved looking at our approach to strategic assessment, so how we undertake to understand the levels of threat, risk and harm to the public, to communities, and how our approaches are shaped to respond to those. This was also to ensure that our strategy, planning and operational policing services and approaches could benefit from a much sounder evidence base that went beyond capturing quantitative information, but also looked at qualitative insights, futures and horizon scanning. So for example, in line with some of the work NPCC is doing just now, ahead of that we used the 7 questions futures approach with leaders and stakeholders and undertook a full organisational assessment. What that did was allow our service to move to, sorry, I'm not great with the slides, allowed our service to move to an outcomes-focused approach, which you can see there on the screen just now. The outcomes describe the difference that we want to make for the people of Scotland and encompass the breadth of policing responsibilities. They recognise the diversity of our communities, and they also allow officers and staff to see how their contributions come together to provide services for the public and communities in Scotland. We found that working to 5 strategic outcomes and 15 clear objectives has been a step forward in Scotland, so that we can consider a wider range of evidence, findings of academic research, public perceptions and best practice to really shape our approaches and set the tone for the whole policing experience in Scotland. It's also enabled the service to begin on a journey to strengthen our performance reporting, and this remains a real work in progress, but it's a priority for us to continue to get the balance of data, qualitative insights and analysis right, so we can openly and transparently provide information on policing, as was so helpfully evidenced by Susan on the work that was done around stop and search and how that so effectively challenged some of the perceptions within the organisation. What we find is that when the service is able to use our performance information, our data, our evidence much more effectively, so we have that type of information, we are much more able to improve our services, taking into account some really important considerations, and these have been mentioned today around equity, equality, proportionality, effectiveness and best practice. And Police Scotland has continued to look to make further progress on this as we look holistically right across our service and try to develop in some of the most critical areas. One of the greatest challenges for policing just now is that right at the start and then at the first line of response, a real challenge for us is how we create an accessible and seamless public experience. It's a critical question because the first response sets the tone for the whole policing experience. We created a public contact and engagement strategy to meet our commitments to develop the way that the public can effectively engage and contact us. The strategy was created for the first time with the public, our people and our senior management teams. We've assessed our current state, our priorities, our vision for services. We've used external and internal research evidence and drawn on worldwide experience of public contact and engagement technologies across all of the blue light services. The purpose of the strategy is to provide the public with the right service at the right time when they need it. And this is very much about developing how we do things as much as what we do, and ensuring that our contact and engagement channels are accessible, relevant and responsive. Policing is about people and technology is an enabler. And what we're doing is improving the technology side to meet the changing needs of people and enable next generation policing. It means it's about ensuring value, making our services accessible for everyone to use, and enabling our people to be both focused and effective. A lot of police services struggled to implement contact technologies because there wasn't clarity of the problem that the technology was seeking to resolve. Digital developments can provide both an opportunity and a risk for our policing services. So the strategy has been created and the implementation plan underway is to make our contact channels more accessible for the public to use, relevant, so supportive to the user circumstances, and responsive, adhering to our standards of service. So what we've sought to achieve is developing how we do things at the right time at the start and designing services effectively will hopefully help us to be more focused and efficient and spending time where we need it most. So addressing some of the challenges and concerns around supply, demand at different times in response to different areas and in response to different wider challenges of crime. We know overall that people at times experience barriers to accessing our services, so we undertook to understand from our public insights what the public wanted, and some of that was different to what we might have expected. While contact with the public would like to be quick, accessible and safe, they also sought out new ways of contacting the police or different ways of contacting policing through text in certain circumstances, through us providing video links to those who were victims of domestic violence, and also being able to show police colleagues video or a picture of the situation that the person was in was something that the focus groups told us and has been built into the strategy. So going forwards, what we're now seeking to do is optimise our channels and the ways of doing things, understand the sequencing for the change in our contact and engagement, communicating effectively with partners, the public and communities on those changes, and most importantly, monitoring the service, ensuring that the approaches we use to respond continue to be equitable, that they work in line with risk, threat and harm, and are more effective for the public and communities overall. Looking forward, the public contact channels that you can see on the left-hand side are what we do today. And in future, our response will change completely in terms of the technology officers will be able to use, but also the different types of approaches that these officers will use in terms of communication, engagement, and how we seek to continue to work as effectively as we can with our public, with our communities and our key partners to make sure that we're developing services that reach out and meet demand and supply the right response. Another area where we have done some work using innovative and service design approaches is a recent collaboration with Victim Support Scotland. This innovation and insight project was to understand what had caused a significant decline in referrals to VSS from Police Scotland. And I raise this one as we've talked, and Susan mentioned the value of data and the value of insights to understand more about policing and the impact that our responses and approaches have. The project set out then to identify collaborative opportunities to increase the overall number of referrals and recognise individuals with the most need. The team approached the project using innovation and service design methodology to evidence issues and remove assumptions from both organisations. The research that was carried out was both desk and user research. The desk research did analysis for both organisations. It understood current processes, looked into good practice in other organisations and UK forces, so Lancashire, South Wales, Essex and Greater Manchester, and looked at the legislative boundaries to sharing information between Police Scotland and victim support. We also did for the first time user research on this really important area of working with victims. Overall, we undertook in-depth interviews with many Police Scotland colleagues across all different ranks and roles within the service, and also with victim support colleagues. We also spent some time in our survey work with 1,465 members of the public who had contacted Police Scotland and asked about their experience. Most of those that were surveyed felt the incident they'd been involved in didn't actually warrant a referral to victim support services, and it meant that their lack of follow-up and lack of take-up of this service was for slightly different reasons than the data would initially have indicated. Other findings included language can inhibit some of the referrals. It's really interesting. People might not want to associate with the term victim and have perceptions and preconceptions about that. There was a lack of knowledge about the approach and services and the support that victim support could provide. The relationships, so between the public and VSS, public and Police Scotland and others, needed to be reframed. In terms of time, offering a referral during a time of crisis or during an incident was generally felt not to be the right time. However, that had been repeated policing practice over many years. And again, the use of a victim care card that was commonly used was also felt not to reflect public needs. This is an area where it was assumed that the referrals were not being made by Police Scotland and that victim support, however, weren't receiving what they needed. And the evidence of the findings and recommendations have actually been used to fully redesign the services collaboratively between Victim Support Scotland, Police Scotland and a range of key stakeholders, including working with Scottish Government. And it's an example of where having a really cohesive service design approach can bring into play some really valuable insights that then help to shape services ahead of us having to go back and practice and understand what may or may not be working. And finally, it's been mentioned a few times in Susan's presentation. I just wanted to touch on public confidence in policing. It's a very important measure and a very important guide of the contribution of policing in our communities. We use our insights now from public engagement to inform our policy, to guide our operational policing, and to create a better understanding of the public's needs and their expectations around policing. We have 2 ongoing surveys that measure confidence and organisational performance. Those are Your Police, which has over 28,000 respondents from across Scotland since April this year, and asks a number of questions around confidence. And then our User Experience Survey, which has approximately 1,200 respondents per month and is conducted with individuals who've engaged with us. And that helps us to measure confidence and satisfaction throughout the user journey. So from first contact through to attending officers and any reflections on the policing approach overall. These approaches have been augmented in the last year and have started to have a greater effect in shaping our policing practice. The Your Police insights in particular have been invaluable during COVID period and have had three main functions over the past few months: shaping our policy, guiding operational policing, and collecting knowledge and monitoring confidence. In terms of gathering knowledge, the survey collects demographic and geographic information regarding respondents, and this has been used by our insights team to conduct subgroup analysis to measure differences in confidence between different groups. It's also helped to build organisational knowledge about specific groups and provide community members with an opportunity to provide their experiences back directly to Police Scotland, which is really, really important. It's also been guiding operational policing. In the Your Police survey, respondents are given the opportunity to provide free text responses to some questions. The research and insights team used these responses to identify the public concerns that Police Scotland could then respond to, providing, for example, increased patrols or visibility in areas which had been identified by respondents. This again is communicated back through local feedback, hopefully presenting a loop where there's a feeling of confidence and the police are listening and responding to concerns. To augment the progress we've made, Police Scotland has a new public confidence board, and this will ensure that we continue to respond to the public in a proactive and a positive way, with the first priority for policing to refresh our approaches and engage more effectively with groups that are seldom heard. This includes enhancing our police public interactions based on continuous public and community feedback and colleague experience, so connecting the two for shaping both policing and practice. So these are some of the ways that Police Scotland is seeking to ensure that our policing services and our approaches are effective, are equitable, but very much continue to build on the bond of trust that sits between officers and members of the public and communities of Scotland, which is of such great importance to us all. And using different approaches with our data, with our insights, with innovation and service design, we hope that we're able to continue to provide really good services across the public, for the public and across our communities, both locally and nationally, to meet the demands and supply and address concerns as best we can into the future. So thank you for the opportunity to respond today.
Thank you, Kirsty. I'm now going to hand very briefly over to Peter for Peter's thoughts, and then we'll start taking questions from the floor, as it were. Thank you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, Peter.
Thank you. Good. So I've had difficulties with my micro. All right, I will be brief. You'll be pleased, or maybe you'll be disappointed to hear that I don't have any slides. So you can either put my face on, or you can have the holding slide. I don't mind which. A bit of background, I suppose, which is relevant to what I'm about to say, and it's also relevant to the period in which a lot of the research was conducted. So the past decade was characterised by a number of things. One of the dominant things was a period of austere public finances, and that austerity in public financing led to, most notably, a reduction in police budgets and a reduction in the number of police. During the same period, we have seen marked changes in the things that police have been asked to do. So the change in the demands for services, accompanied by a shrinkage in services provided by other parts of public sector. But it's really been quite a heady time to be trying to organise police resources, and what this has led to is a considerable amount of effort and emphasis being placed upon demand and resourcing. We've adopted a lot of the language from health. Whether we've adopted the disciplines from is a different question. You'll hear police now talk about triage. You'll hear police talk about threat, risk and harm. So one of the things that came through very powerfully for us in working with John was we are utterly inconsistent in what we mean by threat, risk and harm, and we're inconsistent in how we assess those things, which has clearly then got implications for the decisions that we make. But what we're trying to do is to be more structured and more disciplined in the use of language and start with vulnerability. We'll talk about vulnerability, threat and risk of harm. So we're trying to couple the last two of those together. The consideration of demand and resources often leads to conversations with senior police officers who will say things like, how many police will I need next month? Which is interesting in lots of ways. Firstly, it's interesting because it's become prospective, which is consistent with another development which came out of HMIC, something called the Force Management Statement, which now requires police forces to think about and forecast the demands of services and then express an assessment of the resources they will have to meet those demands. So the conversation is encouragingly becoming more prospective. So there's a desire now, if not a need, to forecast the demand for service, which needs to be rooted in exactly the sort of research that Susan and John have been setting out today. So I welcome that as the foundation. And what that question also leads to is responses, particularly from myself, of things like, well, it depends what you want them to do. It depends what they're already doing. So we've had this idea that officers now have a much greater retained workload. It depends how good they are. So that sets up the conversation about skills and capabilities. And it depends how well they are. And that consideration about officer well-being predates the COVID and the lockdown. There are frightening numbers of officers now who are suffering from PTSD as a consequence of what they've done before. But that seemingly sensible and simple question about how many cops will I need next month is actually really quite complicated to answer. So the sort of work that John and Susan are doing are helping us to inform that sort of modelling. But what it's also exposing for us is there's huge variation in the context in which policing services are provided. I'm saying that from a Greater Manchester perspective. If you extend that to England and Wales or indeed Scotland, different contexts in which policing are provided vary massively, and that's got implications for how those services are provided, not least because some of them are contingent on the state of other public services in that area. So context is a hugely important consideration. What we experience are differences in experience, difference in service provision, which might in part or entirety be as a consequence of that text. The final thing I'll say is, to give some space for questions, we tend to talk in terms of two levers, demand and resource. There is a third lever which we are more reluctant to talk about, which is service standards. And again, that was implicit in both what John and Susan were saying. Born out of pragmatism to match finite resource with escalating demand, many of our operational colleagues will make decisions about service standards. This isn't the language that they use, but what they will do is vary the approach to a call for service. They'll vary the service standard on an hour-by-hour or day-by-day basis. What that's experienced as in our data or experienced by our service users is services which appear to be inconsistent or unreliable. They may even appear to be inequitable. But what we've got to do is trace that back to the reasons for doing that. That is born out of a conversation which isn't transparent about varying service standards in order to try to meet the demand service over the short term. So two things really. I welcome the research and the foundation it gives us and the insights into what's effective, what's efficient, and possibly most importantly, what's legitimate in order to inform what we do and where we do it. I don't think we can gloss over the issue of context and how context changes the nature of policing and the complexity with which services are provided.